Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rachel Wesson. I am the Events and Communications Specialist at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. I think we have some new folks to CLTC in the audience today, so welcome. If this is your first time joining us at a CLTC virtual event, and if you're returning, then welcome back. We're glad to have you. I am thrilled to welcome all of you to our discussion today. Can documentation improve accountability for artificial intelligence? Brought to you by the AI Security Initiative at CLTC. So with that, we're ready to get started. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's panel, Jessica Newman. Jessica is the director of the AI Security Initiative housed at CLTC. And she is also the co-director of the recently launched UC Berkeley AI Policy Hub. And her work focuses on the global governance and security implications of artificial intelligence. So with that, Jessica, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to moderate this event with these wonderful speakers. So I want to thank them for joining us and also thank all of you in the audience for tuning in from around the world. We're really excited about this discussion. So our event today is organized by the AI Security Initiative, which is housed at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. The AI Security Initiative is a hub for interdisciplinary research on the global security implications of artificial intelligence. We work across technical, institutional, and policy domains to support trustworthy development of AI today and into the future. It's part of our mission to host events like these, so we hope to foster interdisciplinary discussion on complex challenges for the future of AI. The discussion today will delve into the documentation of AI systems. Documentation can be a powerful tool to reduce the information asymmetries that are typical with AI deployments and give potential users a better set of expectations about the characteristics, limitations, and risks of a system they're interacting with. AI systems have been deployed in applications that can influence decisions and livelihoods, and yet users of those systems or people impacted by them often don't know they're interacting with an AI system at all, or don't have access to the factors that affect its decisions or what the system is optimizing for. Similarly, people using or procuring an AI system for a novel purpose may not fully know the system's limitations outside of its training environment. So the challenge and importance of AI documentation was first popularized in 2018 with the introduction of work like Datasheets for Datasets, model cards for model reporting, and AI FactSheets. These papers propose templates for documenting the characteristics, context, evaluation, recommended uses, and other relevant information for the datasets used to train ML models, the models themselves, or for a service provided. This work has had a significant impact on the AI community, and some AI releases do now include a model card or other documentation methodology. However, documentation of AI is still far from standardized or universal. Outstanding questions include at what points throughout the AI lifecycle to document, who the documentation is primarily for, and whether and how it does in fact promote sufficient transparency and accountability for the development and use of AI systems. So I'm delighted to introduce our three expert speakers today who are uniquely positioned to discuss these questions. Emily Mcreynolds is part of Meta's AI policy team and leads research engagement on responsible AI with academia and civil society. At Meta, she has co-authored AI ML explainability documentation projects, including system cards and method cards. Before joining Meta, she enabled ethical research and responsible innovation through end-to-end data strategy for HCI, ML, and AI at Microsoft Research. Thomas Kendall Gilbert is a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell Tech's Digital Life Initiative. He previously received an interdisciplinary PhD in machine ethics and epistemology from UC Berkeley. With prior training in philosophy, sociology, and political theory, he designed this degree and research program to investigate the ethical and political predicaments that emerge when artificial intelligence reshapes the context of organizational decision-making. And Dr. Christine Custis is the head of Fairness, Transparency, Accountability, and Safety at the Partnership on AI, where her work focuses on About ML, which stands for Annotation and Benchmarking on Understanding and Transparency of Machine Learning Life Cycles. This initiative aims to bring together a diverse range of perspectives to develop, test, and implement machine learning system documentation practices at scale. Christine is also an associate professor at Shenandoah University and the School of Business, where she teaches and conducts research on how enterprises should use information systems and technology to innovate and achieve organizational goals. So thank you, Emily, Tom, and Christine for joining this discussion today. And before I dive into our questions, I want to remind the audience that we will also save some time at the end for audience Q&A. So please post your questions in the Q&A feature, and we will do our best to get to as many as possible. So to start us off in our discussion, let me turn to Christine first. So Christine, the About ML initiative that you lead has been at the forefront of work on AI documentation for several years. So to start us off, can you tell us why the Partnership on AI identified this as one of the most important problems to work on, and how far has About ML come over the years?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to talk more with this group about the work. I joined Partnership on AI in October of 2020, and the About ML work had been in progress for a couple of years already. And so it's just this rich compendium of resources from the stakeholder community, from our partners who had already been thinking about things like fact sheets and model cards and data sheets. And so there was this call to action to sort of, if we can't standardize, at least let's have this repository, this collection of work that's already in progress so that we can share it with the stakeholder community, we can share it with practitioners so they can find a way to do this work. And I think one of the things that makes it so intriguing is that it's a very simple approach to actioning responsible AI. Documentation throughout the entire machine learning development and deployment lifecycle, throughout the curation and collection of data, throughout the use of that data and the maintenance of the data, throughout the development of the algorithms, the models, the testing, the evaluation, just all sorts of opportunities to keep a record of what you're doing, to be transparent about what you're doing. So I think that's why it caught on with the community. And we continue to collect different methodologies and approaches that people are using to document, whether it's tools. We've done a repository exploration of over 400 different tools that people are using to document, and then also approaches like what actually works on the ground in organizations in different verticals and what they might have to do to customize different approaches. If they're, say, in healthcare and have to deal with PII, or if they're in the UK and have to deal with GDPR. So it's just been a really great opportunity to center the work and to hear more diverse voices in the space about how we all use it and how it could impact us all. I really see a bright future for just the continuation of this work in documentation. And I'm really excited to hear more from folks who are actually trying to do this in their organization. And I'll leave it to the facilitators of this event to share some resources with you. And I hope you'll keep in touch with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. It really is a wonderful repository. And so, yeah, thank you for your work on that, and encourage everyone to go take a look at that. So Emily, Meta just recently launched the AI system cards and AI method cards. So could you talk about why these standards were developed and what their goal is, and what the process of developing them looked like?
Absolutely. Thanks. I want to echo Christine. Thanks for having us. It's so exciting to see more and more people and energy and time focused on this important topic. I think we have seen the number of documentation methods and attempts that you've heard about. I didn't realize it reached 400 and in the PAI repository, but there's all of these options. And so our work began with a commitment around having responsible AI. And really we're on a journey thinking about how do we do transparency in a way that is effective. I think this group of experts knows well, and I think many people who think about these issues know well, that there's a challenge around who you're explaining what to. So one of the first things we did was hold a series of workshops. We had a design jam to think about, with everything that existed, what would be helpful for explaining the platforms and products that Meta has. And one of the first things that came out of that was an approach to what we call levels of explainability. So it's not new that different audiences need different levels of explanations. You can see this in FactSheets and some of the other things that exist. So really thinking through, how do we address the different levels of explanation needed, everything from understanding just that AI exists and that there's an AI system or an ML system, to explaining a decision, explaining a product, and thinking about how we explain to experts as well. So these levels of explainability are really where we got started on this journey. And there's been some piloting of model cards and thinking about what it looks like to document these different aspects. All of that led us to a place where we had talked to a number of experts about what it looks like when you have more than one model. So we talk about how you do the explanations and the documentation when there's so much there to explain. And so the system card is intended to be an external facing tool that helps people understand how a group of machine learning models work together. And so the idea behind this pilot is that the cards will include the impact and the limitations of this system. From my perspective, having worked on this area for several years now, a lot of the conversation has happened in research venues. And so we developed a paper on prescriptive and descriptive approaches to machine learning transparency. And we just recently presented that at the academic conference CHI. And I think that really helps break down why we're doing it the way we're doing it. So if you think about descriptive, describing various components of an ML system, describing the data, but software engineering itself actually has a long history of prescriptive approaches, telling people how to build, what the recipe is to build appropriately, including things like error analysis and safety certification. And so this distinction between the two, one describes an existing system and one specifies how a new system could be created. And I know that can start to sound very academic, and in this context that hopefully is helpful. But we're also taking these things and doing user research, asking experts what they think and how we might be able to implement these, because I think it's really important to remember this is part of a journey. It's not straightforward and easy. If it was, we'd have one type of documentation that everyone was doing, and it would be implemented across all companies, which is why I think we're in the first steps on that journey and hopefully making important progress.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's really interesting to hear kind of behind the scenes, what led to this and kind of what those goals are. So Tom, you were part of a team that recently developed a new AI documentation process called reward reports, which is aimed more directly at reinforcement learning systems. So what was the gap that you all were trying to fill, and how do you see reward reports fitting into this broader AI documentation landscape?
Thanks, Jessica. The gap we were trying to fill with reward reports was, during my PhD research, I was increasingly learning about these new approaches to AI documentation, like model cards, like Datasheets, but was also very exposed to leading technical research on reinforcement learning. And what was curious to me about that was, on the one hand, reinforcement learning, which people might be most familiar with from projects that DeepMind has pursued, so AlphaGo, which famously beat most of the world's best human Go players several years ago now, was basically powered by reinforcement learning. And many researchers that I was collaborating with were telling me, this is the most likely path to artificial general intelligence. This is the holy grail, is reinforcement learning. This is the way we actually build intelligence in an automated system. at scale. And that was fascinating to me. But what was also fascinating to me was the fact that most of the behaviors that are exhibited by reinforcement learning systems are very difficult for humans to understand. Basically, what you have with reinforcement learning is not just a classifier that's trying to predict something about the content you might want to see on Twitter, or whether or not it's your face that it's trying to recognize as a kind of image classification system. What you have is an agent that is kind of teaching itself how to navigate an environment that's been specified by the designer. And often the agent, often because it's so smart, will learn things and experience that environment in ways that the designer doesn't anticipate. And so that posed a major question for documentation, like how would you account for behaviors that emerge from the training as this agent is teaching itself to do things you might have never thought of? So we were really exploring that question and making sense of it. And the result was this reward reports framework. And as we kind of matured that, we realized that actually it was filling two gaps in the documentation landscape that hadn't been filled before, even beyond reinforcement learning. One is, as has already been mentioned, we have established documentation protocols for data, usually called Datasheets, and for the model that is learned from data, called model cards. But there hasn't yet been systematic attention to documenting what the system is trying to optimize for. In other words, what it's trying to do, what its goal is, or in the technical language of reinforcement learning, what is the reward that it's trying to maximize? And that question is important because you shouldn't just care as a user how your data is being used in an AI system. You should also care about what it's trying to do and how that's going to affect your life. That seemed like a really important question that we often don't know how to answer much of the time in these systems. There needs to be documentation of that. Secondly, there's this question of the fact that you can think of a lot of AI pipelines now as reinforcing by nature, even if they're not literally using reinforcement learning. So if you're a designer, a data designer at Twitter or Facebook, you're monitoring a classifier, you retrain it repeatedly. Often Twitter is different every time a user interacts with it because the classifier has changed. There's a new data distribution it's been fed on, it's learned some different representation of you. And there's really a feedback loop there with the designer that monitors it that you can actually think of as reinforcing behaviors, either in the people who use Facebook or in the behavior of the designers who oversee it. And so there's a question then of how do you document not just at any given moment how the system operates, but how does it change the environment over time? How does it change users? How does it change roads if it's a self-driving car? How does it change energy grids if it's a tool being used to optimize how electricity is distributed? These are dynamic questions. And there needs to be a dynamic approach to documentation rather than just a static one. And that's what the purpose of reward reports is.
Thank you, Tom. It's really exciting work and so interesting to dive into the different kind of directions and dimensions that documentation can go and should go. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about some questions around implementation, because we've talked about, a few different frameworks, many tools that are out there, but kind of who is using them and how. So Christine, can we start with you? Who has been most interested in the documentation resources that About ML provides, and how would you describe the adoption thus far? Has there been a lot of interest in that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, in the beginning of the work, I think folks were just very interested in having organizational principles around responsible AI, right? How do we think of ethical AI in the way we manage the development of ML systems, right? And so we've seen an evolution in that thinking to more practical application of how do we do it. So maybe at the beginning, it might have been more strategic thinking, the executive suite, folks in the ethical space, whereas now we're seeing more developers, engineers, program managers, and how do we actually build this into the way we do software development. You know, it's very common that software development lifecycle has these different phases, these different approaches, these different tenets, places where you document, and just thinking about it in terms of the way you develop a software, the way you introduce it to the world. So I think we're seeing more practitioner focused interest in how to do it. And can you look at what we're doing and what are some gaps in the way we're doing it? Where can we be more responsible? So what we've been doing lately is we've been producing pilots where we go out and we say, hey, we've got all these interventions, we've got all these recommendations, take a look, put them into action. You're already doing this work, talk to us. Let us do a 6 to 12 week sprint and follow you around and shadow your work. And let us see how you live with these recommendations. How do they show up for you? What things are you having to customize to fit your industry vertical? So we're just going out to see what we can learn from these practitioners to further evolve the recommendations and what recommendations we can share with them that maybe they don't have in practice. So we're seeing a lot more folks who are boots on the ground actually doing the work of documentation and trying to understand key performance indicators. How do they measure success? How do we know when we've done it right? So those are the people that we're really, really interested in talking to even more.
I love that. And it's so exciting to hear about the pilots. Yeah, I look forward to seeing when those go live online. Thank you. So Emily, what about for you? With how have the AI system cards and method cards been received by engineers and developers at Meta or others at Meta? And is widespread adoption the goal? And what would that look like if so?
So I think these are really important questions to be asking. If we look back 5 or 6 years when a lot of the community was focused on building high-level principles, we had I think my favorite Harvard Berkman report compared 36 of them. At the time there were nearly 90, and so what you see across that is an agreement that transparency is really important, and then explainability is really important, and how we do this becomes a really big challenge, because we aren't starting from zero. We aren't starting from scratch where we have these formats and methods, but we have existing ML and existing AI. So with the great examples we've seen, and with our piloting of figuring out what a system card might look like, if we go to the scale of how a lot of these AI systems function, we aren't looking at a single model. We're looking at maybe thousands of models. So really, we're doing a lot of talking to machine learning engineers, to developers. I think there's widespread agreement that some form of approach to transparency is critical moving forward. And I really appreciate the work of, the Partnership for AI and others trying to figure out what a consensus might be, so that we don't end up with, 400 tools or 20 different artifacts and everybody's using a different one, and we have trouble speaking the language. And when someone goes from one company to another, they're ending up learning a whole new system. And so we're relying on things like NIST's 4 principles of explainable AI, and looking to the European Commission's high-level expert group that developed these ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, to look at what this means on a practical level. I think that is the best approach because these systems are so complex. We know developing documentation is a goal, and how we do it. And it's really like follow this space. We'll see how it goes over the next coming years.
Thank you. It's exciting to hear about, and I appreciate the mention of the kind of key resources out there that you all are looking at too. So Tom, what about for you? Your work is more recent, but what kind of interest have you seen in reward reports from AI developers or others? And what do you think might encourage adoption?
We've gotten a lot of interest so far. I think I should emphasize again, and a lot of my conversations with AI developers reflect this, that there's a different philosophical approach, I think, at stake in reward reports, which is that they are dynamic in nature, and that they're also active. It's one thing to just sort of exhaustively document the features of the data set on which a model was trained. It's another thing to actively reflect over time whether your assumptions about how a system would be likely to behave once deployed are actually true or not once deployed, and the time horizon against which that remains true. It's one thing if it's deployed, it starts to work well. 6 weeks later, something strange starts to happen. Misinformation starts to spread. Traffic starts to flow differently, because people are not objects. People reflect on what they perceive your system is doing when they're using it, and strategically respond to that in any number of ways. And you better do a good job building that in from the get-go, or if you can't anticipate all those things, you have to be ready to reflect on it as it happens, because otherwise your system's not doing what it's supposed to be doing, or at least you can't account for it. And so this is where a lot of my conversations with developers have gone, is what does it mean for you to have this much more active kind of shepherding relationship with your system over time? And that's, I think, where this documentation we're proposing naturally bleeds very directly into what accountability means. It's not just accountability to stakeholders, although it's certainly that. It's also self-accountability. Like, it makes yourself accountable for your own assumptions over time, because those are the things that guide how you define what the goal was, the constraints on the optimization, the features over which this agent is trying to explore its environment. And so most of what we're doing right now for the next few months is really just try and socialize this idea amongst practitioners, amongst as many AI developers as we can, and people who also have this more kind of dynamic perspective on this landscape. And I should add that we're going to organize a workshop next month at Reinforcement Learning and Decision Making, the RLDM conference, and that'll be at Brown on June 11th, I believe is the date. So if anyone is going to attend RLDM and would like to learn more, I would encourage you to stop by the workshop, and I can put a link to it in the chat.
Thanks, Tom. I love this idea of the kind of relationship over time between the developers or the broader community engaging with the system. So thank you to all of our speakers. I want to open up the questions now to the audience. So if you haven't yet put your question in the Q&A, please go ahead and do so. We've got some coming in here. So let's start off with this one. So this is a question about the multiple dimensions to consider with documentation, for example, different audiences, different timescales. So the question is, how do you think about, first, the resources that are needed to maintain and update all of this documentation over time? And secondly, documenting potential future impacts or harms that might not have occurred yet. So maybe Christine, could we start with you on that one?
Those are really smart questions. Let me start with the harm question. So I think, in a perfect space, we would be able to proactively plan for these harms. We'd be able to categorize risks. We'd be able to lay that all out in the beginning throughout the development process prior to production, prior to going live. But I think what we have to be okay with is having a strong foundation, a strong mechanism for identifying harms, even when they occur, and being able to mitigate like real time. So I think it's okay that you're going to participate in the development and deployment of systems, but making sure that we have a way to identify and deal with harms, even if they get past us and they occur. There's so many downstream effects. There's so many collateral effects in the sense of safety critical AI, things that we should consider, the temporality, the magnitude, just the causal proximity. There's direct and indirect. So there's so many things to consider. And I think if we're thinking about it holistically, even if we don't stop all the harms, having a clear understanding that they could occur, and then having a platform from which we can address them when they do occur, that's going to be like, that's going to be what helps us. Otherwise, I think we'll pause and we'll stop in our tracks, and it'll be too scary to do any of this. This is all very new territory for us. In terms of the cost, the resources required, it's tremendous, but the resources required to deal with not having documented, I'd say they're probably even more so. So I did want to share, we talked about the return on investment of documentation in a webinar we did last year, and I just want to share that in the chat if you want to go back and look. But thinking about how you measure success, thinking about the resources you put towards documenting and who your audience is. We talk to a lot of folks who are documenting right now, and then we ask them, so who's reading this? And it's like, I don't know, they just told us to do it. So who is your audience? Who are you talking to? Who's going to use this? So writing things that people are going to read, and based on what Tom's talking about here, writing things that can evolve and be living and added to is just sort of an important way to approach that. But I'll defer to my colleagues here who want to say more about that.
Yeah, Emily or Tom, either of you want to jump in on this question?
I'll just briefly speak. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but yeah, Richmond's question I think is great. And I mean, this is really the entire purpose of reward reports, is to have this ongoing commitment to show the receipts of how a system is behaving as it's behaving, and in light of the assumptions about how it would have behaved. The entire purpose of that is to be this dynamic, temporally sensitive approach to documentation. And again, data sheets, model cards are absolutely important and pivotal. But I think that what has been missing for some time is really this kind of reflexive effort to make designers, reflect on their own role as they go about maintaining these systems and rethinking them over time. Facebook, it's not the same product now as it was 10 years ago. And a lot of that's because we're not the same as we were 10 years ago, if you've had an account for that long. And there needs to be, I think, an interface that by which that kind of problem space can get, explored, deliberated about, reflected upon. And I would just echo what's already been said. I think the costs of not doing that are much greater than the costs of doing it.
So I'll jump in. I think, both of the panelists have already said the resources are required are immense. I don't think that surprises anyone. I don't think people underestimate that this is a significant commitment to be able to do this. I'll speak to before my time in my current role, watching the documentation techniques develop over the years, and having them develop out of research is fantastic. That's where groundbreaking things should come from. But then seeing some of them piloted, and again, this is years ago experience prior to Meta, prior to Microsoft Research. I was at the University of Washington Tech Policy Lab. And I think it's easy to underestimate how hard this stuff is to do at scale, not just the resources and the time cost. And so there's a point at which we have to talk about incentives and how we incentivize things. So one of the things I have seen over the last 10 years that I think is helpful to consider is not just thinking about what's required or the resources or how hard it's going to be, and it's super important to consider the harms. But some of these documentation things can run into 10s, 20s, lots and lots of pages. And so as Christine highlighted earlier, like, who's reading it? I don't know. We're just required to create it, right? How many times have we read that in a user study about these kinds of documentation things? And so one of the things I've been trying to think through and work with our researchers on is how do we show this makes better machine learning in the end? That the incentive is there, right? Like this is the concept behind prescriptive approaches to machine learning. Like we've seen this work in software where it means you build better software. And so if your ultimate goal is something that does the reinforcement learning or the machine learning that you want to reach. You have a goal. You don't just make this stuff in the ether. So demonstrating that these kind of documentation techniques actually create a better outcome means that you'll incentivize the engineer or the developer who might not be as knowledgeable about this stuff, and they'll have it as a priority in that way.
Thank you so much. There's so many good ideas going. I want to get to as many questions as we can. So we have one here from Tim. He asks, how much of these efforts can be industry agnostic versus how much needs to be industry specific? And if the efforts need to be industry specific, then why? And are there specific performance or other aspects that demand industry specificity?
That's a really cool question. I'll jump in. You know what came to mind is Datasheets. So we've got Datasheets. This is this methodology, this approach for documenting the data that we use in the development of, models, algorithms. But recently, I just saw there's a paper. I know Lauren Wilcox is one of the authors, but there's several authors, and it's called Health Sheets. So it's like Datasheets is the core concept, but folks in the healthcare community decided we've got to customize this for ourselves to make it meaningful. So I think that these concepts are really broad reaching, whether it's model cards or data nutrition labels. And then you get into certain industry verticals, or you get into certain communities of practitioners where they kind of take it and make it their own. And that's perfectly fine. So that's one example that I have of where you can sort of get the intention of the approach and then make it your own and make it meaningful for your group. I don't know if other folks have examples like that as well.
Yeah, Emily, anything you would want to add to that?
I think there's a lot of opportunity for these kinds of things to be modular. And we've talked about this a little bit already in this hour, but saying, you have to answer these 12 questions. That's going to be out of date when the next advance comes a month from now, a year from now. So thinking about how they can be modular, how they can be adaptable, how they can be not necessarily interchangeable, but what we can do to make them work across things. Because of course, industry specific, there are perfectly good reasons why you might need industry specific. Health has different questions and different needs. But then if they are industry specific, then how do you look at them overall when you're trying to, when you're a policymaker or a researcher trying to figure out how are we doing this, and yet you're faced with a multitude of different approaches and different answers to different questions. So I think some form of modular, some sort of baseline, and I see a lot of that in the About ML project of bringing everything together so we can see it kind of in all one place.
Thank you.
I would echo some of what's already been said. I think, this is when we were thinking through reward reports and what their significance was, we were increasingly reminded of the fact that what it means to make a good self-driving car. This is just not the same kind of question as what it means to make a good, recommender system on social media. It's not just because using social media is not like driving a car or being in a car. It's also because I think as a society, we're much closer to a consensus on what driving is for and what we want it to be. We want it to be safe. We want it to be reliable and efficient, get you from point A to point B. It's a lot harder to define in some ways exactly why it is, even speaking for myself, why I go on social media as often as I do, or for specific reasons. There could be different contexts in which I might do it professionally, personally, to keep up with friends. There's lots of different reasons there. And it's a lot harder to specify those purposes, those goals. And that naturally, I think, poses different problems in different domains. So there are some forms of documentation that should be probably domain agnostic, because we do just need to do a much better job of showing these receipts no matter where we're using AI. But I think that there really does need to be the specificity, because we need to deliberate very differently about ends in different parts of our lives, because that's how our lives are structured. They're structured differently depending on what the activity is.
So a lot of the kind of leading frameworks that are out there have been developed by people in industry. But we have a question here asking, can industry be trusted to provide accurate, transparent documentation of these algorithms? The person asks, it seems that engaging more stakeholders in the process is critical, particularly populations that are most impacted and have the least agency traditionally. So do leading tech companies have the credibility to lead such an effort? Maybe we could start with Christine. I know, you're leading a multi-stakeholder effort representing many people from industry, but also other sectors. What would you take on that?
So I guess it's not a yes or no, or can they be trusted? The companies are made up of humans, and we've all got these different agendas, right? So I guess sans policy, without regulation, which I think is fast approaching. How do we do it? I don't know. I think that the approach that we try to take within the partnership is, how can we talk about this? How can we be a part of the conversation? How can we get tech companies to share with us in advance of putting this out into the world? How can we, I know, Emily, you can talk more about this, just that whole concept of diverse voices, getting more eyes on it before it's live, thinking about harms and impacts before it's actually out in the world. So I don't know. I don't know if I can answer that very well. So I'm gonna punt to
No, that was great.
Well, and Christine, thank you for that, because during my time at the University of Washington Tech Policy Lab, one of the things I'm very proud of that the team developed, authored by Batya Friedman and Meg Young and Lasana Magasa, is this diverse voices approach. So there's an unsurprising, well-known history of how policy is developed. It's not that, I think this question frames it really well. It's not necessarily by those who are the most impacted. And so the diverse voices approach talks about how to bring in those stakeholders. I often talk about lived experience experts. So when we go out and talk to experts about what we're working on, it's not just the folks who might get invited to a panel like this, but diverse voices. We did work on augmented reality. And so we met with people who were low vision or had no vision and got their perspective on augmented reality. There's up in my corner here is Driverless Seattle. And so as part of that, we went and met with groups who only bike, people who don't drive, people who walk. And so not just thinking about the car drivers or the industry creating the technology or the policymakers, but really making sure that there's an inclusive approach. And that I really appreciated the pointer to diverse voices. Maybe someone can drop it in our chat here to share with people, because I think it's a method that's really stood the test of time. It's now almost 6 years old, back in my old days at the University of Washington. So.
Thank you. And Tom, anything you would want to add on this point?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I also think that there are aspects of that question that I'm not credentialed to answer, because I think they're political questions, and I think they're absolutely important, and I think that they're kind of for all of us, or at least for citizens to deliberate upon. The question, I mean, we can trust whoever we want, but that doesn't mean that they're trustworthy. The definition of what trustworthy means is something that I think for certain systems of a certain scale, a certain level of high stakes, becomes a political question about how we want to live as a society together collectively and organize our lives. I think it's, for among other things right now, most of the job of experts to show the receipts and do a better job of showing the receipts. And people can make their own judgments about, once they see those receipts, whether these systems are trustworthy or not. And if they're not, then we could change them. Or if they are, you can keep using them. I think that I'm incredibly excited for where tech is going and where AI is going, because it lets me think about these things and decide for myself what the answers to these questions are. not because I can just sort of let it run my life for me.
Well, I just want to really quick, I really appreciate that highlight, because I think we're seeing growing calls for regulation, and that's an important aspect of thinking about how does industry and government and experts and researchers come together to create the best practices and the standards that make sense, that allow innovation and also protect society. So I don't think anyone who's already paying attention to this would disagree that this is a complex area that's a challenge to existing frameworks, and that's why we're here and doing this work.
So we just have time for one last audience question. We have a couple people asking a little bit about the limitations of documentation. So on one hand, how could you possibly have documentation that worked for all stakeholders? Even if you translated this across languages, how would you be able to make sure you were actually enabling transparency for everyone that you cared about? And also, what about issues around, proprietary knowledge, patents, security concerns potentially of putting out more information about the models or the systems out there? So anyone want to speak to some of the potential limitations we might see with documentation, and maybe how we get around those?
I think this is part of what documentation is about. I don't see documentation as a solution to those questions. I think those are really important, deep questions that we don't completely know how to answer for every AI application. They might be easier to answer with some than others. That's maybe an empirical question in part. But what reward reports are trying to do is actually make this part of what you're documenting. Part of what you should be documenting, I think, as a designer, is your relationships with stakeholders and how those relationships factor into your assumptions about the specification of the system, what it's optimizing for, whether you think certain commitments to stakeholders are being protected or not over time based off of its behavior, and if that ends up being true, what you'll change about the specification, about how you oversee it, about what's being documented accordingly. That's what needs to be documented, is your assumptions and choices as a designer, just as much as what is the model, what is the data, what is this component. It's your role that needs to be also on the page, so that it can be worked on rather than shoved under the rug, which I'm afraid is often the risk we face.
I'll plus one that, documentation is the artifact and the process. It's the journey, it's the work, it's the intention. It's not about what you get at the end, it's about what you create as you do it. Think about the journey of developing software, all the decision points, all the pivots, just keeping track of why you made certain decisions. It's the work. That is the work. So I'll have to agree with that.
Emily, anything you would want to add on this question of potential limitations?
I just love what my co-panelists have said, because I think it's a process and a journey is phrases we hear, and some people might take that as like excuses when you're talking about limitations, but it really is when you approach these kinds of topics, there isn't a destination. There's a how we figure this out and how we figure it out together.
So we're getting close to the end of the hour already here, but I've got one final question for all of the speakers, which is, what is at stake if we don't get this right? And what is your biggest hope for the future of AI documentation? Let's go Tom, Christine, Emily.
I think what's at stake if we don't get this right. So we've seen a lot of, again, I mentioned this at the start. Part of the motivation for my own work in this space was these my collaborators, AI theorists and researchers who are really worried about artificial general intelligence. Might just be just around the corner, or even if it's farther off, could be this transformative event in human history. The risks could be catastrophic. The payoff could be unprecedented. How do we make sense of that? As I've come to work in this space more and more, I actually think there's a different risk that increasingly keeps me up at night, which is not whether the scale of the harms is so extreme that we don't want it. It's really more that we won't even be able to account for what these systems are doing. Their outputs could be mystifying, their behaviors could be confusing. We have a formal understanding of what we've told it to do, but really have very little practical understanding of why it might act a certain way on a given day, or how it might affect certain subpopulations of people whose own goals and behaviors we don't understand very well. I think the risk here is really kind of existential opacity and kind of fog of war that might set in as we just increasingly let systems of unprecedented scale and sophistication go undocumented, because then the risk is not that they're hurting us, it's that we'll never know if they're hurting us or not.
That's such an awesome term, existential opacity. I'm totally using that someplace. Okay, but I'll give you credit though. What's at risk? Let me answer the other question. What am I hopeful for? I'm really hopeful for this trend in participatory design, where we include more people in the development and deployment of these systems, where we ask users, where we ask impacted non-users, how might this affect you if it does get out into the world? So I'm really excited about the increased participatory design of this work, the increased transparency, where folks are bringing more people to the table to talk about it before it goes live. And then what's at risk? So many things that the opacity is super important. I think we get further and further away from what's happening, but also beyond the effective altruism, which is sort of that far out in the future harms. Right now, there are harms right now that we haven't quite identified, characterized, learned how to mitigate. So just the increase of those harms that are right now impacting us, not having a handle on that and not being present and aware to react. So that's what I would say.
And now I have the pressure of going last after these brilliant remarks. Thanks so much, Jessica. I really appreciate that. I like how Christine flipped it. So I want to talk first about my hope for the future. I'm so excited to see more people focused on this. It reminds me of when I got into privacy in the mid 2000s. And there wasn't as much work. It wasn't a common word. It wasn't what people were focused on. And so over the last 5 or 6 years, watching more and more resources and more people get involved, I really have strong hope that we're going to figure out a way to do this well, despite all the challenges. I do think there are some pretty big stakes involved. There's so much development and so much reliance and so much magical thinking about what AI is. And, sometimes I just want to remind people it's data that we put an algorithm on and we call it machine learning, but it's not that smart, guys. It's not that smart yet. And there was a great quote recently from someone who was actually one of the originators of the About ML project, about how focusing on the technology and making it magical means we take some of the responsibility away from the humans who are building it. And so I think it's important for us to focus on who's building it and what those impacts are. And again, just to end on a positive note, like my hope is that more people will focus on this and more resources will be dedicated to it, and that more people see how important it is.
Yeah, well, these really are important and powerful insights. And I really just want to thank all three of you for what you're doing to improve AI transparency and accountability. I think it's incredibly important work, and it's a joy to host this discussion and help share that work with more people. So yeah, thank you to our audience for the great questions, and to our speakers again for a provocative discussion. Rachel, back to you.
Thanks so much, Jess. And yes, here. Thank you so much to our esteemed panelists for that very interesting and engaging conversation. We really appreciate you taking the time out to share your experiences and your perspectives in this space. I'm going to share my screen here again because I also want to give a quick shout out to our various CLPC supporters, our network of community partners and foundations, as well as our industry partners whose support helps us in our mission and make events like this possible. And finally, for those of you still around and interested in keeping in touch with any of our panelists to follow their great work, we have various ways that you can do so, stay in their orbit. We've got emails, we've got Twitter handles, we've got LinkedIn profiles where you can follow or contact these folks directly. And we've also included a few ways that you can keep in touch with CLPC at the bottom of the screen. So please do follow us on Twitter or head to our website where you can sign up for our newsletter so that you won't miss future events from CLPC as well as other exciting news and research coming up. So I will leave this slide up here for just a minute in case folks are jotting down information. But again, thank you so much to everyone in the audience for engaging with us today and asking some great questions. And once again, to our panelists and to our moderator, Jessica, we look forward to seeing you all next time. Take good care in the meantime.